The hall was silent. Thousands of people sat waiting. Cameras pointed toward the shining stage where Sandra Bullock smiled softly under the bright lights. It was the night of her Lifetime Achievement Award. The air was filled with admiration, excitement, and curiosity. For years, people had spoken about her strength, her laughter, her grace. But tonight, something deeper lingered in the room, something unsaid. The host leaned forward, his voice calm but curious. "Sandra," he said, "you've played so many roles, lived so many lives on screen, but away from the cameras. After everything you've seen and lost, do you still believe in love?" The question echoed through the hall. Even the sound of the cameras seemed to fade. For a moment, Sandra didn't move. Her fingers brushed against the silver ring she always wore, and her eyes drifted somewhere far away. Her silence spoke louder than words. It wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the silence of memories. The host waited. The audience waited. Around the world, millions of viewers leaned closer to their screens. Finally, Sandra took a deep breath. "That's a beautiful question," she said softly, "but it's not a simple one." She looked down for a moment, as if gathering pieces of her past from the floor beneath her. "You know," she began, "sometimes love doesn't come dressed in big gestures or perfect moments. Sometimes it's quiet. It's the kind that shows up when no one else does." The audience leaned in. Every word carried a weight. She wasn't acting now. This was her truth. "There was someone," she continued, her voice steady but emotional, "who once showed me that love isn't about what you say. It's about what you do. He never said much, but he always showed up when it mattered." The host tilted his head slightly. He didn't need to ask who. The name was already floating in the minds of everyone listening. Keanu Reeves. But Sandra didn't say his name. Not yet. Years earlier, she had first met Keanu on the set of Speed. She was nervous, excited, trying to prove herself in a world that often judged too quickly. The days were long, the stunts were hard, and sometimes she doubted if she belonged there. One evening, after a long shoot, a piece of equipment broke. The crew was tired, and most had gone home. Sandra stayed behind, helping the young camera assistant gather the cables. When she turned, she saw Keanu still there, too. He wasn't talking to anyone. He wasn't acting like a star. He was on his knees helping fix the dolly track, quietly tightening bolts with his own hands. "You don't have to do that," she said softly. He looked up and smiled, that calm, gentle smile that could ease any storm. "Maybe not," he said. "But if I can help someone finish faster, why not?" There was something about that moment. No spotlight, no cameras, just kindness. It stayed with her. In the weeks that followed, she noticed more. Keanu would arrive early just to make sure the crew had coffee. He would carry heavy boxes when no one was watching. Once, when a background actor tripped and fell, he helped him up before the medics even arrived. Sandra had seen many stars rise and fade, but there was something different about Keanu. He wasn't trying to be special. He just was. When filming ended, they went their separate ways. Years passed. She became a global name, celebrated, honored. But deep inside, there were days she felt empty. She lost her mother, faced heartbreak, and lived under the endless noise of fame. During one of her hardest times when her mother was sick, she arrived at her trailer one morning and found a small bouquet of white lilies. No note, no name, just a gentle presence in the chaos. The next day, another bouquet arrived. And the next. She tried to find out who was sending them, but no one seemed to know. It continued for weeks, always the same lilies, always silent. It wasn't until years later that she learned the truth. A friend from the old crew told her quietly, "It was Keanu. He never wanted you to know." Sandra remembered standing still for a long time after hearing that. She had always known he was kind. But that kind of kindness, silent, private, pure, was something deeper. Back on the stage, the audience listened breathlessly as Sandra spoke. "Sometimes the people who teach us about love aren't the ones who try to impress us," she said. "They're the ones who help us see the good in the world when we've forgotten it's still there," the host whispered. "Was he someone close to you?" Sandra smiled again, this time with tears shining in her eyes. "Yes," she said softly. "Closer than I realized." She paused, looking out at the audience. The crowd was quiet, moved by the honesty in her tone. It wasn't gossip. It wasn't a story for attention. It was a confession from the heart. Then, she said something that made everyone hold their breath. "He once told me," she whispered, "the most beautiful love is the one that doesn't need to be claimed." The camera zoomed in on her face. A tear rolled down her cheek. Somewhere in the front row, a woman wiped her eyes, and somewhere far back, a man in a black suit sitting quietly in the shadows smiled faintly. No one noticed him. No one recognized him. Not yet. But that man was Keanu Reeves. He had come quietly, without cameras, without announcement, to watch her receive her award, to hear her voice, to see if she would remember. As the lights dimmed for the next segment of the show, Sandra looked toward the corner of the hall. For a split second, their eyes met. Her breath caught, and she almost smiled. He lifted a hand slightly, almost invisible to others. A small wave. It was as if time stopped. Years of friendship, silence, distance, and unspoken affection passed between them in that single glance. And though no words were said, both of them knew something. This story wasn't over. It was only beginning again. The night ended with laughter, applause, and flashes of cameras. But behind the curtain, where the noise couldn't reach, Sandra sat alone for a moment. She held the silver trophy in her hands, but her thoughts were far from awards. She kept thinking about the question that had frozen her earlier, the question about love, and about the man sitting quietly somewhere in the crowd. She didn't imagine him. She knew he was there. She had seen those familiar eyes, calm, patient, kind. After the ceremony, people surrounded her, friends, journalists, photographers, all asking for a few words. She smiled politely, answering softly, but part of her was searching the hall again. Keanu was gone. A journalist asked her, "You looked emotional on stage tonight. Was there something personal behind your words?" Sandra gave a small smile. "Maybe," she said. "Some stories don't need to be told. They're meant to be felt." The reporter nodded, not realizing the depth behind her words. When Sandra finally left the venue, the night air was cool. The sky above Los Angeles glittered with city lights. Her car was waiting, but before getting in, she turned and looked around one last time, as if expecting to see someone standing by the shadows. No one was there, but she could almost feel it, the calm presence of someone who had been near, watching not as a star, not as a fan, but as a quiet guardian. The next morning, Sandra woke up early. Her home was peaceful, filled with morning light. She made coffee and opened the curtains. The award stood on her table, glowing softly in the sunlight. She smiled, but a feeling of longing tugged at her heart. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Just one line. "You spoke beautifully last night. Proud of you." There was no name, no signature. But she didn't need one. She knew exactly who it was. Her heart softened. She typed back, "You were there?" A few seconds passed. Then came the reply. "Just for a while. Didn't want to interrupt." She smiled at the screen. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed, "You never interrupt. You just appear when it matters." He replied, "Old habits die hard." It was a short exchange, simple, but it carried more emotion than pages of dialogue could. Sandra sat on the couch sipping her coffee, rereading the messages with a soft smile. For years, their connection had been quiet, built not on grand gestures, but on silent understanding. The next few days passed quickly. Interviews, events, and meetings filled her schedule. Yet, every time someone mentioned kindness or love or memories, she thought of him. One evening, she attended a charity dinner for a children's hospital. While walking through the hall, she saw a framed picture of a donor list on the wall. One name stood out, anonymous, "Donation for the Children's Wing Project." Below it, written in small letters, was a note, "In memory of laughter shared on set." Kindness never fades. Her heart stopped. She recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Keanu's, the same curved letters she had seen years ago on a note he once left for her during filming, a note that simply said, "Thank you for making a tough day easier." She stood there quietly, surrounded by chatter and music, but her eyes filled with tears. He had never mentioned this. He never took credit for the donation. No one even knew it was him. For Keanu, kindness wasn't something to show. It was something to live. Later that night, back at home, Sandra found herself sitting by the window watching the city lights. Her thoughts wandered to their past. She remembered a night long ago during the lake house. They had wrapped up filming late. It had started to rain, and everyone rushed for cover. But Keanu had stayed outside, helping the lighting crew pack their gear. When she stepped out with an umbrella, she saw him drenched, smiling as he handed a cable to a technician. "You're going to get sick," she said, offering him the umbrella. He laughed softly. Someone has to make sure they get home safe first. She stood beside him that night, sharing the umbrella, watching the rain fall on the set. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them was warm. She hadn't realized it then, but that moment had stayed in her heart all these years. A few days after the award night, Sandra received a small brown package at her doorstep. There was no sender name, only her address written in neat handwriting. She opened it carefully. Inside was a simple photo frame. It held an old picture, one she didn't even know existed. It was from the speed set, the day they had wrapped shooting. Everyone was laughing, holding cake, messy from confetti. In the background, Keanu was looking toward her with that gentle half-smile. There was also a folded note behind the picture. She opened it slowly. It said, "Sometimes the best stories don't end. They just pause until we're ready to listen again." No signature. But once again she knew, her eyes filled with tears. She whispered to herself, "You never change." Meanwhile, somewhere across the city, Keanu sat in a quiet corner of a coffee shop. He wore a simple jacket and a baseball cap. No one recognized him. He was reading a small newspaper article about Sandra's speech. A waitress came to his table and smiled. "You look familiar," she said jokingly. He smiled politely. "I get that a lot." As she walked away, Keanu looked out the window. The city moved fast, people rushing, cars flashing by. He folded the article and placed it carefully in his bag. He wasn't there to be seen. He just wanted to know she was okay. He had learned long ago that the best kind of love wasn't the one that demanded attention. It was the one that silently protected from a distance. Days turned into weeks. Rumors began spreading online. Fans noticed small things. Keanu attending the same events, pictures of him leaving just as Sandra arrived. Interviews began to ask questions. "Are you and Keanu still in touch?" One journalist asked her during a show. Sandra smiled carefully. "He's one of the kindest souls I know. Sometimes silence speaks louder than anything else." Her answer made headlines. People wanted more. Gossip channels twisted it into romance, but Sandra didn't correct them. She knew the truth was something deeper. One night she sat watching an old interview on TV. It was Keanu's from years ago. The interviewer had asked him, "You've worked with so many amazing actresses. Which one do you admire most?" He had smiled and said softly, "Sandra. She has the kind of heart that makes the world a little lighter." Her chest tightened as she watched it. She hadn't known he said that. She whispered to herself, "And you have the kind of soul that makes it worth believing again." The next morning, Sandra woke up to another message from the same number. "Coffee today?" She smiled. "Only if you let me pay this time." The reply came, "Deal." "Same place as before?" She laughed quietly. "You always remember." And so, after years of silence, they were about to meet again. The world outside had changed. They had changed. But the kindness between them had not. She didn't know it yet. But this meeting would reveal a truth far greater than she expected. Something that would bring tears, gratitude, and a shocking realization about how far his kindness had really gone. The story of quiet love was only halfway told. The morning was bright and calm. Sunlight spilled across Los Angeles, painting every street in gold. Sandra Bullock stepped out of her car quietly, wearing simple jeans, a cream sweater, and dark sunglasses. She wasn't here as a star today. She was just a woman going for coffee with an old friend. The cafe was small, tucked between old brick buildings. the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. It had been their meeting spot years ago, back when both were younger, busier, and always trying to escape the noise of fame. She smiled as she saw the faded wooden sign still hanging above the door. Inside, the air smelled of roasted beans and rain-soaked wood. She spotted him at once. Keanu sat at a corner table reading a newspaper, his hair a little longer, his face calm and thoughtful. He wore a plain black jacket and looked up just as she walked in. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the years between them disappeared. He stood up, his smile soft. "You're late," he said gently. She laughed. "You're early." As always, they hugged. It wasn't dramatic or forced. It was warm, real, and full of quiet understanding. They sat down, and the waitress, recognizing neither of them, came over to take their order. "The usual?" Keanu asked. Sandra smiled. "You still remember?" "Some things don't change," he replied. The waitress brought 2 cups of coffee. They sat in silence for a while, just watching the steam rise between them. Finally, Sandra spoke. "You disappeared fast that night," she said softly. "I saw you in the crowd, and then you were gone." He looked down, his voice calm. "I didn't want to take the moment from you. It was your night. You earned that stage." She tilted her head slightly. "You were part of that moment, whether you wanted it or not." He smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I prefer watching from the back row. It's quieter there," she chuckled softly. "You and your quiet rows." As they talked, the tension slowly melted. They spoke about old sets, about friends who had drifted away, and about how strange it felt to have people watch every step of their lives. But beneath the laughter, there was a layer of something deeper, something unsaid. Finally, Sandra leaned forward. "I found something at the hospital charity last week," she said. "A donation under no name. But the handwriting looked familiar." He looked at her silently. "It was you, wasn't it?" she asked. He didn't deny it. He just gave a small nod. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you always hide the good you do?" He looked out the window, thinking for a moment before answering. "Because," he said quietly, "when you give quietly, the gift belongs to the world, not to you." Her eyes softened. "You haven't changed. Neither have you," he said, smiling gently. They sat there for a while, listening to the faint hum of conversation around them. The world outside moved fast, but inside that cafe, time stood still. After their coffee, they decided to take a walk near a nearby park. It was early afternoon, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. People passed by without recognizing them. For once, they could just be 2 people enjoying a simple day. As they walked, Sandra noticed a group of children playing near a fountain. One little girl was trying to fix her toy boat, struggling to tie a small string. Before she could move, Keanu stepped forward, crouched down, and helped the girl tie it properly. The girl smiled and said, "Thank you, mister," before running back to her friends. Sandra watched the moment quietly. "You can't help yourself, can you?" she teased softly. He smiled shyly. "Maybe I like fixing things." She looked at him closely, her voice soft. "Maybe you like healing people, Keanu, even when they don't ask." He didn't answer, but his eyes said everything. As they sat on a park bench, Sandra's phone buzzed. It was a notification from a journalist asking for a comment about her emotional confession during the award night. She sighed, putting the phone away. "They never stop, do they?" Keanu said quietly. "No," she said, "but I've learned to focus on what's real. And this," she gestured around them, "this feels real." He nodded. "It always was." There was a pause, gentle and full of unspoken memories. "You know," he said after a moment, "there was something I never told you." She turned to him. "What?" He hesitated, then smiled softly. "After the lake house, I kept one of the props. The letterbox." She laughed in surprise. "You didn't." "I did," he said with a grin. "It was broken, but I fixed it. And now it's in my backyard. What for?" He looked at her quietly. "Reminds me that some connections don't depend on time." Her smile faded slightly, replaced by a tender silence. "That movie meant a lot to me," she said softly. "Not because of the story, but because of how we worked together. It felt like Peace! You brought that peace, he replied. You always did. She looked down, her voice trembling slightly. You know, when I spoke about love that night, I wasn't trying to make news. I was just tired of pretending that love has to be loud to be real. He looked at her carefully. And you think quiet love lasts longer? She smiled faintly. The quiet ones always do. As the sun began to set, they decided to leave. Before parting ways, Keanu handed her something. It was a small notebook, the cover slightly worn. What's this? She asked. Open it when you get home, he said. It's nothing big. You know your nothing bigs always end up meaning everything, she said with a smile. He smiled back. Drive safe. She watched him walk away, calm and unhurried, blending into the crowd like he always did. That night back home, Sandra placed the notebook on her table. She hesitated for a while before opening it. Inside, she found handwritten notes, all addressed to no one. Each page had short thoughts, reflections, and pieces of poetry. Some read, "Kindness doesn't need a reason. Pain passes faster when shared quietly," and one at the very end. The truest form of love is when you can wish happiness for someone, even when you're not the reason for it. But one page near the middle caught her attention. Written neatly, it said, "Dear friend, you once gave me laughter when I had nothing, and that laughter became the reason I still believe the world is kind." There was no name, but her eyes filled with tears. She recognized the words. They were about her. She closed the notebook gently and held it close to her chest. Later that night, she walked onto her balcony. The city glowed beneath the sky. She whispered to herself, "You never stopped caring, did you?" Her phone buzzed again. A message from the same number. "Did you read it?" She smiled, replying, "Every word." Then came his reply. "Some things don't need to be said out loud." "They're already understood," she typed back. "Maybe. But thank you anyway," he replied. "You don't have to thank me." "You already did. Years ago." She stared at the screen, unsure what he meant. What had she done years ago that he never forgot? A feeling stirred in her chest, something she didn't yet understand. And as the night grew quieter, Sandra stood there in silence, unaware that Keanu's words were not just kindness. They were a clue to a truth she was about to discover, a truth that would reveal the greatest act of love she had never seen. The next morning, Sandra woke with a restless feeling. The words in Keanu's notebook echoed in her mind, especially the last line. "You already did, years ago." She couldn't shake it off. It sounded like he was hinting at something bigger, something she had missed. After breakfast, she decided to visit the old film studio where the lake house had been shot. It had been years, but the place still felt the same, quiet, peaceful, surrounded by memories. The lake shimmered under the sun, and she smiled faintly, remembering how they used to sit near the pier between takes, sharing jokes and hot chocolate. She walked toward the old wooden cabin that served as the main set. The caretaker, an older man, recognized her at once. "Miss Bullock!" "It's been a long time," he said warmly. She smiled. "Just visiting old memories." He hesitated, then said, "I've got something you might want to see. It's been sitting here for years." Curious, she followed him into the cabin. He opened a small box filled with old props and letters. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was an envelope with her name on it, written in neat handwriting she knew too well. Her heart skipped. "Who left this?" "A man," the caretaker said. "He told me to give it to you if you ever came back. He said you'd understand when the time was right." Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a short handwritten note. "Dear Sandra, there are things I never said because words sometimes ruin what silence protects. Years ago, when your mother was sick, I visited the hospital one night. I couldn't find you, but I left something there, a donation, not from me, but from her name. I wanted you to know that kindness runs in families. She raised someone who gives light even in her darkest days. You once told me I make others believe in good people, but it was you who reminded me to believe again. Sincerely, always, Keanu." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. She remembered the hospital staff telling her years ago about a mystery donor who covered the cost of her mother's final treatments. She had never known who it was. It was him. He hadn't wanted her to know. Not for gratitude, not for recognition, but simply because he cared. She folded the letter gently, pressing it to her heart. Her voice broke into a whisper. "You were always there, even when I didn't see you." As she looked out at the quiet lake, she finally understood the meaning behind his message. The greatest acts of love were never meant to be seen. That evening, Sandra sat by her window, the letter still in her hands. She read it again and again as if the words themselves carried warmth. Every sentence felt like a whisper from the past, a truth she had never noticed. After a long silence, she picked up her phone and typed a message to Keanu. "I found your letter." For a while, there was no reply. Then her phone buzzed. "I wondered when you'd find it," she smiled sadly. "You could have told me." His reply came fast. "Some things are better discovered when the heart is ready." Her eyes softened. "Maybe my heart's ready now." After a pause, he sent one more message. "Then let's meet tomorrow." Same cafe. The next day, she arrived early. Her heart raced as she waited. Keanu walked in quietly, as he always did. Calm, humble, and almost invisible, despite being one of the most recognizable faces in the world. He sat down, giving her a small smile. "You look like you didn't sleep. You wrote something that doesn't let people sleep," she said softly. He chuckled. "I didn't mean to keep you awake." She placed the letter on the table between them. "You paid for my mother's treatment. Why didn't you ever tell me?" His eyes lowered. "Because it wasn't about telling. It was about doing what was right." "But you didn't have to," she said, voice trembling. "I wanted to," he said quietly. "Your mother once sent me a thank you card after Speed. She said I reminded her of kindness she used to teach you. I just returned what she gave me." Sandra's eyes filled. She reached across the table, her hand resting over his. "You've spent your whole life giving, Keanu. Doesn't it ever get lonely?" He smiled gently. "It only gets lonely if you expect something in return." She looked at him for a long moment, tears glistening in her eyes. "You really believe love can exist without being said, don't you?" He nodded slowly. "It's stronger that way. It survives distance, silence, and time." They talked for hours about life, loss, and the moments that shaped them. People passed by without noticing who they were. It felt almost like fate had hidden this small corner of the world just for them. When they finally stepped outside, the sun was setting. Soft golden light touched their faces. Sandra turned to him. "Do you ever regret not saying things sooner?" Keanu thought for a moment. "Maybe sometimes. But I've learned that love isn't measured by timing. It's measured by truth." She nodded quietly. "And the truth is, you've changed how I see love." He smiled faintly. "And you've reminded me why kindness matters." They stood there for a while, the world moving around them, and it felt as if time had paused, again. Before they said goodbye, Keanu reached into his pocket and handed her a small box. "Something for you." She opened it slowly. Inside was the silver bracelet she had given him years ago after the lake house, engraved with the words, "For your quiet kindness." "You kept it?" she whispered. He smiled. "Always. But now I think it belongs back with you." Her throat tightened. "Why now?" "Because you finally saw what I was trying to say," he replied softly. She looked at the bracelet, then at him. "What were you trying to say?" He smiled, his voice barely above a whisper. "That love doesn't end when the movie does." Tears filled her eyes. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. He gently touched her shoulder and said, "You don't have to say anything." And just like that, he walked away, quietly, humbly, leaving her with tears, a bracelet, and a heart that finally understood. That night, Sandra appeared on a late talk show. When the host asked about her belief in love, she smiled through her tears and said, "Someone once taught me that love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just listens, helps, and walks beside you in silence. I used to think I'd never find it again, but it turns out it never left." The audience applauded, unaware that the man she spoke of was watching from backstage. Unseen, smiling quietly. The next morning, Sandra woke to the soft glow of sunrise touching her window. The silver bracelet rested on her wrist, warm from her skin. She touched it gently, remembering his words from the night before. Love doesn't end when the movie does. It had been a long journey, years of friendship, distance, and quiet care that never faded. She made her coffee slowly, thinking about the letter, the notebook, and every act of kindness that had led her here. Keanu had shown her that love wasn't something to chase. It was something to notice. As she sat by the window, her phone buzzed. It was a message from him. "Check your mail today." She smiled softly, typing back, "You really like surprises, don't you?" He replied, "Only the good kind." An hour later, a courier arrived. The package was small, wrapped in plain brown paper with no name. She opened it carefully. Inside was a simple wooden music box. When she turned the handle, a gentle melody began to play. The same tune from the Lake House soundtrack. Beneath the lid, a note was carved into the wood, for the moments that didn't need words, for the friendship that became something deeper. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness never fades." No signature, but she didn't need one. Sandra closed her eyes, letting the music fill the room. It wasn't a love letter. It was something purer, a quiet farewell to years of unspoken emotion. Later that afternoon, Sandra decided to visit the small children's shelter where Keanu had once donated under her name. When she arrived, the staff recognized her and welcomed her warmly. One of the caretakers handed her a framed photo that hung near the entrance. It was of Keanu sitting with the children, laughing, holding one of their hands. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "In honor of all quiet acts of love that change the world." Her eyes softened. She realized this place wasn't just charity, it was a message. This was how he expressed love, through kindness, through giving, through silence. A young boy approached her and handed her a small folded drawing. It was a picture of a man and a woman standing under the stars, smiling. The boy said shyly, "He told us to give this to you if you ever came." Her voice trembled. "He did?" The boy nodded. "He said the stars never forget kind people." Sandra knelt and hugged him, tears falling silently. That evening, back home, she sat under the balcony lights. The bracelet sparkled faintly on her wrist. She looked up at the night sky, remembering his words, his quiet smile, his endless compassion. The city below was loud, but her heart felt calm. Suddenly, her phone buzzed again. Another message. "Watch Channel 5. She turned on the television. It was a live charity broadcast. Keanu was there speaking softly about empathy, about giving without being seen. "Sometimes," he said on screen, "you don't need to change the world with noise. You can change it with small, quiet kindnesses. One smile, one act, one person at a time." The audience applauded, but his tone stayed gentle. He ended his talk by saying, "Love doesn't always need to be returned, it just needs to be remembered." Sandra smiled, tears in her eyes. A few weeks later, they met again, this time not as stars, not as old friends, but as two people who understood each other's hearts completely. They met at the lake, the same one where he had left that letter years ago. The sun was setting, painting the water gold. He stood by the pier, hands in his pockets, looking at the horizon. She walked up behind him quietly and said, "You still like sunsets?" He smiled. "They remind me that endings can be beautiful too." She stood beside him, the water reflecting their faces. "So this is the ending?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No. This is the part where silence says everything we never needed to explain." They stood there for a long time. No words, no promises, just peace. "Finally," she whispered, "thank you for loving me in the kindest way possible." He looked at her and smiled. "And thank you for seeing it." The wind carried their laughter across the lake, gentle and timeless. That night, when she returned home, she placed the letter, the notebook, and the music box together on her table. Next to them, she added a small handwritten note. "Some loves don't need to begin or end. They just live quietly, changing us forever." She turned off the lights and looked out her window one last time. The stars were bright. Somewhere out there, she knew he was looking at the same sky, grateful, peaceful, kind.